Okay, the name of the story is I'm Not Used to Sneezing Like This. Slowly, ever so slowly, the morning sun began to rise into view from the horizon. As it did, the sky began to turn from dark blue to a much lighter shade, and the stars slowly faded out of view. Before long, you could hear birds singing wherever you went. In one of the houses upon which the sun cast its morning light, Sonic was still asleep in his bed, breathing in and out quietly. As the rays of sun reached his eyelids, however, he slowly opened his eyes. Sonic sat up in his bed, yawning quietly into his hand before rubbing his eyes. As his vision cleared, he lowered the blankets from his body and stepped out of his bed, stretching his arms up as he did. Although his vision was a bit blurry at first, he could almost immediately tell that a new day was just beginning. The hedgehog made his way over to the closet, picking out some white socks and a pair of his favorite red and white shoes before putting them on. First the former, then the latter. Then he headed over to the window and opened the curtains, smiling at what he saw. The sky above him was almost as blue as his quills, with only a few white clouds for good measure. And the air was gradually warming up. Sonic smiled. He couldn't wait to discover what was in store for him today. As Sonic walked away from the window, however, a slight tickle found its way into his nose, causing it to twitch slightly. At first he didn't think much of it, but it wasn't long before the tickle became more intense. Sonic lowered his eyelids, tilting his neck back as his mouth fell open. He was going to sneeze. Ah! Sonic inhaled. His eyes fell closed as he prepared himself for the impending release. Achoo! When he finally brought his upper body forwards for the sneeze, however, it came out sounding a lot different than he expected. It was a barely audible sneeze, similar to when a kitten or a puppy sneezed, and the sound of it lasted for only a split second. In fact, there wasn't even a hint of spray, nor did it feel like it brought much relief to his nose. Sonic stood back up, throwing his hand over his nose as his eyes went wide. Normally he would have rubbed his nose, but now that he'd heard how a sneeze turned out, he almost wasn't sure whether or not it was a real sneeze. After a few seconds, Sonic removed his hand, looking down at his nose. The tickle that he felt moments ago had gone away. That was weird, Sonic said to himself. With that, he headed out of the bedroom and down the stairs. He made his way into the kitchen to make himself some coffee, and when it was ready, he poured himself some. The hedgehog sat at the table with his cup of coffee, taking a rather deep breath through his nose to inhale its strong but sweet aroma. At least it would help him wake up. That being said, almost as soon as he'd taken in the coffee's scent, another tickle found its way into his nose. His eyes quickly closed, and another sneeze came forth. Achoo! Sonic rubbed his nose with the side of his hand, sniffling a couple of times. At this point he could see that his nose had developed a slightly red tint, which changed its color from black to almost a dark brown shade. But he was more focused on why that sneeze had been the same as the first one. He could have sworn he had a far more audible sneeze than that. Despite this, Sonic drank his coffee, one sip at a time. A few minutes later his mug had been emptied, and he got up to put it in the dishwasher. Then he headed out of the kitchen and into the living room. Almost as soon as he got there, however, another tickle found its way into his nose. Sonic lowered his eyelids as he tilted his neck back, bracing himself for another sneeze. Yeah, ha-choo, choo, ha-choo. Unexpectedly, Sonic released 3 sneezes, all of which were barely audible and lasted for little more than a second. By the time he'd finished, however, the insides of his nose began to feel a bit congested, while the outside kept its slightly red shade. With a couple of audible sniffles, Sonic rubbed his nose with his forefinger, looking cute as he did. Thankfully, there was a box of tissues on the end table close to him. He pulled a tissue out of the box and blew his nose a couple of times, trying to clear his nasal passages. It didn't work, however. Instead, it seemed to coax out another mild sneeze. Achoo! Why is this happening? Sonic asked himself, wiping his nose with his tissue. Am I getting sick or something? Just as he'd questioned that, Sonic heard a couple of knocks on the door. A sign that someone had come to visit, or perhaps asked to hang out with them. The hedgehog lowered the tissue from his face, then placed his tissue in his pocket for later. Then he made his way over to the front door, only stopping when he was there. He placed his hand on the doorknob, turned it, and pulled the door open. "Hey, Sonic." Tails was standing at the door, a smile on his face. The sight of him brought a smile to Sonic's face as well. "Hey, Tails." Just after Sonic had greeted him, however, another tickle found its way into the hedgehog's nose. He took a few steps back, lowering his eyelids as he did, and then he broke into a small sneezing fit. "Achoo! Achoo! 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 Achoo!" And to Tails' surprise, all of these sneezes were mild and barely audible. "Bless you, Sonic." Tails had a concerned look in his eyes as Sonic rubbed his nose with his forefinger. "Are you feeling all right?" "Yeah." Sonic didn't realize it, but that most likely wasn't the case. "I just woke up with a tickle in my nose." "That doesn't surprise me," Tails replied, "but I wasn't expecting you to sneeze like that." "Sorry." Sonic sniffled a couple of times. "For some reason, I've been sneezing like this since I woke up this morning." "That's strange. Why don't I come inside?" Tails suggested. "Maybe I can figure out what's causing this." With that, Sonic stepped out of the way, and Tails made his way into the house. As he did, however, the end of one of his tails brushed against Sonic's nose, immediately causing it to itch. Without warning, the hedgehog let out another sneeze, but this time he stifled it, putting his fist to his mouth as he did so. That probably wasn't a good idea, though, as he could feel the congestion return to his nasal passages. Sonic reached his other hand behind his back, pulled out his tissue, and blew his nose again. As he wiped his nose afterward, Tails turned to look at him. "I think you might have caught a cold, Sonic. Either that or it's hay fever." "Are you sure about that?" Sonic wanted to know. "I don't feel that bad. I just feel like something's bothering my nose." Tails thought for a moment about what could be causing Sonic to feel this way. "Do you have a medical book somewhere?" "Yeah, but I don't read it much. But if you want to have a look at it..." Sonic sneezed again, throwing his hand over his mouth as he did so. He had to have been lucky that this sneeze didn't have any saliva. Otherwise, his hand would have gotten sprayed. "Be my guest," Sonic resumed, rubbing his hand underneath his nose. With that, Tails headed over to the bookshelf, looking through it once he was close enough to it. As he did, Sonic wiped his nose with his tissue. He had a feeling he was going to need some more of these throughout the day. Soon Tails had found the medical book, so he reached his hands in and pulled it out. He opened it up and looked through its pages, trying to find something related to sneezing. He found a couple of articles about the common cold and allergic rhinitis, but he ignored them. Sonic did mention to him that he wasn't feeling sick after all. "Hey, what's this? Tiny sneeze?" Tails raised an eyebrow as he got to an article he couldn't recall ever hearing of before. Out of curiosity, he began to read it. "A somewhat rare variant of the common cold. The tiny sneeze virus causes whoever it infects to begin sneezing quietly and mildly, sometimes only once, sometimes multiple times. It may also cause their nasal passages to become congested and/or the outside of their nose to turn red. Despite this, it is completely harmless and will subside in as few as 3 days or as long as a week, depending on how healthy the infected person normally is. Once caught, precautions must be made by the infected person to avoid infecting others." "Hey, Sonic?" Tails asked, and Sonic looked up at him. "I've just read this page about the tiny sneeze virus, and I think it might be what you have." "Tiny sneeze? Never heard of that." Sonic gave another sniffle, trying not to bring another tickle into his nose. "Basically, you've caught a cold that causes you to sneeze more quietly than how you normally sneeze," Tails clarified. "Oh." Sonic looked a bit dismayed, but Tails closed the book and placed his hand on his shoulder. "Not to worry. You'll feel better in a few days." "If you say so." Sonic's nose began to twitch again, and he couldn't help but look down at it as it trembled here and there. His eyelids lowered as his pupils moved about for a few seconds. Ah! He brought his tissue up to cover his nose, and then the sneeze came. "Shoot!" Bless you. Tails blessed him as Sonic wiped his nose with his tissue. Thanks. Sonic sniffled a couple of times. He then balled up his tissue and threw it behind his shoulder, and it landed in a nearby trash can. By the way, as for why I came over, Tails then said, Team Chaotix asked me to hang out with them at the park, and I wanted to know if you'd like to come with me. Sure, said Sonic, but first, I'm gonna need some more tissues. I'll be right back. With that, Sonic turned around and made his way to the downstairs bathroom. He flicked on the light switch once he'd gotten there, only for another tickle to find its way into his nose. This one must have been from the light above his head. Ha! The hedgehog inhaled twice, then pressed his forefinger underneath his nose. Surprisingly, it worked, and he breathed a sigh of relief. That was close. Satisfied, Sonic picked up an unopened box of tissues and brought it with him out of the bathroom. He made sure to turn off the light as he went, and soon he was back in the living room with Tails. You ready to go? Tails wanted to know. Yeah, pretty much. Sonic nodded. Barely 3 seconds after he'd replied, however, the tickle returned to his nose, causing it to tremble for a few moments. He gave an almost inaudible inhale, followed by another light sneeze. Shoo! Once he'd lost his breath, Sonic sulked as he rubbed his nose again with his forefinger. The same forefinger he'd used to keep his sneeze from escaping less than 5 minutes ago. Bless you, Tails repeated, but Sonic only sniffled in response. Once he thought his nose had had enough relief for the time being, the hedgehog placed his box of tissues behind his back, and he and Tails made their way out of the house. I don't think my time at the park is going to be that much fun, Sonic thought to himself, sniffling quietly. Well, at least I have these tissues in case this tidy sneeze-a-bite gets out of hand. Sonic could feel his nose twitching and trembling as he and Tails headed to the park. The hedgehog brought his hand up to rub under his nose a few times, but it didn't help as much as he would have liked. Aside from the tickle that was constantly returning to his nostrils, the scent of blooming flowers as well as their pollen filled the air. The tickle in his nose got worse, and his nostrils began to flare too. Ha! Sonic stopped as he lowered his eyelids, tilting his upper body backward with every inhale. Huh? Tails stopped as well, then turned around to look at Sonic. The moment he saw the sneezy look on his face was the moment he realized what was going to happen. Uh-oh. Sonic gave a couple more inhales, bringing his arm up to his opening mouth, and the next thing he knew, he'd been sent into another sneezing fit. Luckily, he made sure to put his elbow over his mouth with each sneeze. Choo! Ka-choo! Choo! Choo! Hap-choo! Choo! By the time he'd finished sneezing, Sonic's nose had become quite stuffed up. He stood back up as he rubbed his nose with his forefinger, blushing a bit in embarrassment. Gesundheit. Sorry, Tails. Sonic apologized as he continued to rub his nose. You might not want to tell the guys I just sneezed like that. That was really weird. I'll admit it was, but don't worry, I won't tell him, Tails promised, though Sonic wasn't sure about that. A few minutes of walking later, Sonic and Tails had arrived at the park. They could see the 3 members of Team Chaotix, Vector the Crocodile, Espio the Chameleon, and Charmy Bee, sitting in a circle and talking. Vector looked up, smiling as he saw the arrival of the blue hedgehog and the yellow fox. Yo, Sonic and Tails! Vector called, waving. Hey, Sonic! Hey, Tails! Charmy greeted them as well once he saw them. Hey, guys! Sonic and Tails greeted them in unison and made their way over to them. What up, dudes? Vector asked. How's it going? Great, thanks, Sonic replied. He sat down with the Team Chaotix members, and Tails did the same. Hey, Tails, did I ever tell you about this awesome cartoon I saw on the internet? Charmy asked Tails. No, what is it? Tails wanted to know. Okay, so there's this girl named Bessie, and she's part of this Girl Scout troop, and she's trying to get as many different badges as she can. As Charmy began talking, Sonic looked over at him, then took a deep breath and sighed to himself. He looked over at Espio, seeing that he was also ignoring Charmy. You know, sometimes me and Vex wonder why his name is Charmy and not Chatty, Espio mentioned. Once he starts talking, it's not easy to shut him up. Yeah, I bet. Sonic sniffled a couple of times, then brought his hand up to rub his nose a few times. Thankfully, Espio didn't seem to think anything was wrong with him, and neither did Vector. That being said, Sonic could feel a slight tickle in his nose, and as the minutes rolled by, it seemed to get worse. It felt like the virus was inside his nasal passages, tickling the insides of his nose in an attempt to make him sneeze. I'm gonna sneeze, aren't I? Sonic thought to himself, looking a bit dismayed as his nose twitched. But if I sneeze, who knows what these guys'll think? Better not let that happen. His nose didn't seem to agree, however. It continued to tremble around slightly, and Sonic's eyelids began to lower. His mouth fell open as his breath began to hitch, and his chest began to heave. Sonic inhaled, trying to keep it as inaudible as possible. His forefinger went to press under his nose after the third inhale. At that moment, the hedgehog's breath returned to normal, although there was still a clear itching sensation in his nostrils. That being said, Charmy spotted Sonic with his finger underneath his nose out of the corners of his eyes, so he stopped talking and turned his attention to him. You okay, Sonic? Charmy asked. Sonic looked over at him, then removed his forefinger from his nose. Yeah. I just almost sneezed again. Oh, that reminds me, Charmy replied. The other day I found some really pretty flowers and they smelled really good. I tried sharing them with Espio and Vex, but I think their pollen made him start sneezing. Don't remind me, Espio said, not amused. Sonic could feel his nose twitching and trembling again as Charmy brought that up. Sometimes even the mention of pollen was enough to bring a tickle into Sonic's nose, and the fact that his tiny sneeze was already bothering him didn't help matters. Knowing what was going to happen, Sonic put his forefinger back underneath his nose and tried to hold back his returning urge to sneeze. At this point, all four of his friends were looking at him, Tails in concern, the other three in curiosity, but he couldn't pay any attention to that. Sonic inhaled, his eyelids falling closed as he tilted his neck back. At the same time, he tried to think denying thoughts to keep the sneeze from escaping. It was the only idea he could think of besides what he was already doing. Don't sneeze. Don't sneeze. Don't sneeze! But it was clear that his nose didn't want to listen. He was fighting a losing battle, and the only way out was to surrender. As he gave a final breath, Sonic's eyes fell closed as he moved his upper body as far back as it could go, and his free arm moved to cover his opening mouth. And finally, it came. Choo! 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 Achoo! Sonic released 5 sneezes in just 5 seconds, bringing his head forward and covering each sneeze with his elbow as he did. Little by little, the tickle faded away from his nose, until a 6th sneeze brought it to a definite end. Achoo! Sonic then sulked as his forefinger immediately went back to the underside of his nose. Espio, Vector, and Charmy all looked at him, eyes wide and irises shrunken with disbelief. They couldn't believe what had just happened. What the? Espio muttered. Did you just... Charmy asked. He didn't finish his question, but Sonic knew exactly what he wanted to ask. Tails placed his hand on his friend's shoulder, looking at him with a look of concern in his eyes. Gesundheit, Sonic. Thank you. Sonic continued to rub his nose, blushing as he did. Vector put his fist to his mouth as he snickered a bit. He'd never heard Sonic sneeze the way he just did before, but now that he did, he almost didn't know what to make of it. He thought it was quite funny, although the others didn't think so. Sorry, guys, Sonic apologized, sniffling a couple of times. You see, I have this thing called Tiny Sneeze, and... What the heck is a tiny sneeze? Vector asked, almost incredulously. It's an illness that causes whoever it infects to begin sneezing quietly, Tails explained. He can't really control it. You mean like a kitten? Charmy asked. Yeah, you could say that. Sonic looked away for a moment in embarrassment, and Vector couldn't help but laugh. Oh my gosh, you've got to be kidding! Espio and Sonic turned their heads to look at Vector. Neither of them looked too amused, and when Vector saw the look in their eyes, he stopped laughing. Sonic sniffled a couple of times, but couldn't relieve the congestion in his nose. Ugh. He reached behind his back and pulled out his box of tissues. Then he pulled one out and blew his nose, but he couldn't get his nasal passages to clear up. Gee, Sonic, I didn't know you weren't feeling good, Charmy said as Sonic wiped his nose. Sorry. It's alright, Sonic replied. It's not your fault. I should have told you what was up before the truth came out. He gave another audible sniffle, but then sneezed again, much to Charmy's surprise. Vector couldn't help but stifle another laugh, however. Achoo! Bless you, Charmy said as Sonic rubbed his nose with his forefinger. Gesundheit, Espio replied. He looked over at Vector and nudged him with his elbow to snap him out of his amusement. Oh, sorry. Bless you, dude, Vector said to Sonic. Hey, if it makes you feel better, why don't we take care of you? Charmy asked as Sonic brought his tissue back up to his face and wiped his nose again. I mean, me and Vector took care of Espio a couple of times when he wasn't feeling good. As he said that, Espio rolled his eyes. As much as I'd like that, Sonic replied, I think I'd rather just take it easy for a while. But thanks. Another sniffle as he balled up his used tissue. All right, suit yourself, said Vector. And, sorry I laughed. I swear, I had no idea a tiny sneeze was even a thing. It's all right, I guess. Sonic rubbed his nose again. Tails stood up, then reached down to take Sonic's hand and help him up. As Sonic let him, his other hand made sure to pick up his box of tissues so he wouldn't lose it. Come on, Sonic. Let's find you a spot where you can get some rest. Sounds good. Sonic managed a little smile. With that, Sonic and Tails walked away from Team Chaotix. As they did, Sonic rubbed his nose a bit more with his hand. It would probably be a while before his congestion would clear up, and a little longer before he'd fully recovered from his tiny sneeze. But he didn't mind too much. At least it wasn't as bad as other times where he'd gotten sick. And at least he had his friends to support him in his time of need. The end.